Hi, I'm Roy Schwartz. I write about pop culture for CNN.com, The Forward, and IGN, and others, and I am the author of Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. The clip we just watched isn't from a Holocaust drama. It's from a science fiction superhero movie. What is Auschwitz doing in a superhero movie? What do the horrors of the Holocaust have to do with superheroes? In the case of the X-Men, everything. Probably the most important figures in comic book history, Marvel Comics editor and writer Stan Lee and artist Jack Kirby created together the Fantastic Four, Thor, Ant-Man, Hulk, Iron Man, the Avengers, Black Panther, and many, many others. Both were also first-generation American Jews born and raised in New York. Stan Lee was born Stanley Martin Lieber, and Jack Kirby was born Jacob Kurtzberg. Kirby was more engaged with his Judaism than Lee was, which we discussed in the Jewish Origins of the Marvel Universe episode, exclusively for CSP members on the CSP website. But both were very culturally Jewish, and that Yiddishkeit influenced their work. In September 1963, they introduced the X-Men, so they will soon be celebrating their 60th anniversary, and the comic reflected their sense of otherness, their ethnic self-awareness, their assimilationist hopes and anxieties, and the post-World War II, post-Holocaust liberalism. The X-Men, if you don't know, are mutants, which is a small race of people who are hated and persecuted by a humanity that considers them inferior and simultaneously a threat. The X-Men are proud of being mutants, but since they can largely pass for normal humans, they use secret identities and costumes so they can assimilate in public, which is exactly what Eastern European Jews did in America that many other minorities couldn't. Since their creation, the X-Men have been the most clear and consistent allegory in comics about prejudice and persecution of minorities and the importance of coexistence and tolerance. Over the years, this metaphor has evolved to represent Black people, LGBTQ people, and others, and puberty in general, but we'll be focusing on the Jewish thread, which continues to this day. Mutants have special abilities which begin manifesting in adolescence, paralleling in the Jewish context the bar and bat mitzvah, the age in which Jews officially assume the mantle. The X-Men learn how to use the gifts of their special heritage in a private school in Westchester, New York, essentially yeshiva. I'm standing right outside it, as you can see this lovely building. And it's led by Professor Charles Xavier, aka Professor X, who is more rabbi than principal in how he functions. Aside from being highly educated, he is also a powerful telepath, yet he is confined to a wheelchair. Intentionally or not, he embodies the Jewish stereotype of intellect over physicality. He also conforms to the Jewish biblical tradition of heroes who are good and fight for what's right, but are deeply flawed, including morally. He isn't just a typical Marvel superhero with feet of clay. He's quite a bastard. And in that sense, this conception of heroism has nothing, it was nothing short of groundbreaking in comics at the time, and it's not something found in the New Testament and with Christian saints in general, but it is in the Torah. And we find it, for example, with Noah, who was a drunkard and a flasher, or Abraham, who abandons his son Ishmael and disinherits his other 6 sons. Jacob, who favors Joseph over his brothers. David, the greatest king of ancient Israel, seduces and impregnates the married Bathsheba, then orders her husband Uriah the Hittite to his death in combat so he can marry her. Solomon marries Gentile women and is led to idolatry. Samson blindly loves the Philistine enemy woman, Delilah. Even Moses, the most righteous of the Hebrew heroes and the closest in standing to Jesus, is hot-tempered and both doubts and disobeys God. There are also direct biblical references in the comics. One of the X-Men is Angel, and he has wings. That's quite the reference. And Professor X has an evil fratricidal brother named Cain, as in Cain and Abel, better known as the Juggernaut. Xavier being cerebral and Cain being physical also evokes the other famous sibling rivalry in the Bible of Jacob and Esau. But the Jewish signification of the X-Men is less about characters and more about themes. There was a lot going on at the time of their creation that they reflected, including the Holocaust and the Jewish struggle increasingly entering the American consciousness. And of course, the civil rights movement. It's no coincidence that the civil rights movement came on the heels of the Holocaust. For many Americans, the Holocaust brought about a sobering realization about the nature of bigotry, and for Jews, it created a moral imperative. Having survived genocide and as non-whites who could pass for whites and for the first time were accepted, at least provisionally, as whites, American Jews were in a position to understand and to help. Most were true to power progressives, and the fighting spirit that they saw in their nascent Israeli brethren emboldened them. Just for example, Jews comprised over 30% of white freedom fighters, the activists who rode buses to the South to picket segregated establishments and register black people to vote, which is more than 10 times their share of the population. President of the American Jewish Congress, Rabbi Joachim Prince, spoke at the March on Washington about Jewish solidarity with the Black cause, born of a shared painful history of slavery, segregation, and ghettoization. When Martin Luther King gave his historic I Have a Dream speech, it was one he had co-written with his close friend and advisor, Stanley Levinson. And these are just a few examples. The X-Men's core message is that the other, the them, is actually us. And it was particularly powerful in the context of Cold War anxiety and paranoia. McCarthyism especially, which predominantly targeted Jews and whipped up post-war anti-Semitism. Another possible influence was the persecution of the comic book industry only a few years prior to the launch of the X-Men, which comics were blamed for juvenile delinquency in America. They were subjected to a massive media smear campaign and ultimately Senate subcommittee hearings, which all had an implicit and sometimes explicit streak of anti-Semitism. But that's an episode for another time. Many of these themes, unfortunately, are as relevant today as they were then. In issue 14 of the X-Men in November 1965, Xavier reads a newspaper that warns against hidden mutants planning to replace and enslave humanity, which is the same as Nazi propaganda from just a few years prior, and in its modern American version, what we call replacement theory, which claims that Jews conspire to pass for white to replace white Christian demographically and culturally with non-white people. Remember in 2017 in Charlottesville when they chanted, "Jews will not replace us"? That's what they meant. Stan Lee generally shied away from admitting to any metaphors or influences in his work. And he said that making the X-Men mutants was just an easy, lazy way for him to give them all superpowers. But then, why make mutants hated? Why persecuted? Why are they the other? The Fantastic Four were mutated by cosmic rays and they became beloved celebrities. Whether he meant to or not, he did. It was a statement on being unique, different. being born into a different group. What's more, mutants are a separate race. So the hatred of them is inherently racist. And again, these stories came out only 18 years after World War II and the Holocaust. The X-Men's archvillain, their nemesis, and Xavier's ideological opposite is Magneto, who is also a mutant. In issue number 4 of the X-Men, Magneto recounts how he saved the Scarlet Witch, another mutant, from a pogrom in an Eastern European village. While Xavier is more reconciliatory in his approach to humanity, Magneto is more militant. He is disillusioned with the prospect of coexistence, and he justifies his actions as self-defense. But Magneto is also supremacist himself, believing in mutant dominance, which we see here has made him, you look at his troops, they're Nazis, it's made him the very enemy he loathes. This is some heady stuff for a kid's comic book in the 60s, right? Xavier and Magneto's relationship and opposing worldviews have led to the pop culture myth, often reported as fact, that Lee and Kirby based them on Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. The X-Men comic came out a month before MLK's I Have a Dream, so this was definitely the zeitgeist, but Lee said it was not deliberate, though valid. The parallels only work, they really also only work on a superficial level, and they're a little problematic for a number of reasons, not the least of which that Magneto is a race supremacist, and Professor X is not a pacifist. His X-Men are trained and operate like a paramilitary team. Anyway, the original X-Men comic was not a success. Lee and Kirby left in 1966 with issue 19, and the series lasted until 1970, issue 66. Kirby left Marvel soon after, decamping to DC Comics. What he did there we'll discuss in episode 7. This is episode 5. In May 1975, the X-Men were rebooted with a special comic, Giant Size X-Men #1, that you see here in the center, featuring mostly new characters by Jewish writer Len Wein and artist Dave Cockrum. We'll talk more about Wein in episodes 9 and 10. The regular series was given to young writer Chris Claremont, a British-born Jew, who was joined in 1977 by fledgling artist John Byrne. Then, that's the point when the series became a massive success, and the two of them became industry superstars. They essentially defined the X-Men as we know them, emphasizing deeper characterization, melodrama, and long-term storytelling, all Lee and Kirby innovations that they really took to the next level. Claremont especially became the guiding force of the franchise, writing the X-Men consecutively until 1991 and intermittently since, which is remarkably long for such a transient industry. Claremont, whose mother was Pashkovietsky, has very openly talked about his Jewishness being the window through which he approached the X-Men. Specifically, he volunteered in a kibbutz in 1970 for a couple of months, Nativ HaLamid in the Negev, where he met rugged Israelis and Holocaust survivors. He described the experience as an epiphany, which he made it his mission to convey to his audience. Claremont is the one who made Professor X and Magneto frenemies and fleshed out their backstory. And he based their relationship on David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. David Ben-Gurion was the founding father and first prime minister of Israel, and he was left-wing and fairly dovish, while Menachem Begin was a right-wing hawk, and the British mandate even considered him a terrorist. But he evolved, and eventually, as the 6th prime minister of Israel, he was the one that made the first peace treaty with Egypt, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And that's sort of what Claremont had in mind for Magneto. In X-Men 150 in 1981, Claremont revealed that Magneto is a survivor of Auschwitz. And like many survivors, he renounced his faith, religious and otherwise, after the Holocaust. Claremont also showed Magneto's time in the camps in pretty horrifying detail. That's this red story in the middle in classic X-Men 12 in 1987. The kid that we saw in the movie clip earlier, the one that opened this episode, that's him. That's Magneto. Interesting to note, though it was patently obvious, Magneto was never explicitly Jewish. He never said in the comics that he was. They never showed a yellow Star of David on his camp uniform or anything like that. That came later, as you can see on the right with the Hanukkah menorah. After the war, Magneto, then going by Eric Lencher, became a Nazi hunter working for the Mossad. He then moved to Israel, where he volunteered in a psychiatric hospital for Holocaust survivors in Haifa. There, he met and befriended a young Charles Xavier, as well as a Dachau survivor named Gabrielle Haller. Xavier and Haller fell in love, or didn't last, and she went on to become the Israeli ambassador to the UK. Notice the Holocaust imagery here. Through the device of a dream sequence, Haller is dreaming this, Claremont and Byrne tie together fantasy and history. It tells the reader this is a superhero comic, but it's about something real. Unbeknownst to Xavier, his romance with Gabrielle produced a love child, David. David is also a mutant, codenamed Legion for his multiple personalities. He has a multiple personality disorder, and he spent his childhood catatonic and later autistic. He can't properly function and control his powers until those personalities learn to coexist, which you can take as a metaphor for Israel and its Arab neighbors or the different factions of Israeli society. Take your pick. Either way, when Legion got his own TV show in 2017, loosely affiliated with the films, he was whitewashed with no mention of his Israeli or Jewish background. Magneto has his own Kinderlach Mishagas, and we will get to that in a bit. In X-Men 129, 1980, which is sort of a world famous in Inside Comics, Claremont and Byrne introduced Kitty Pryde, aka Shadowcat, the first prominent explicitly Jewish superhero. She is the granddaughter of Polish Holocaust survivors. The family was originally Prydemen, who wears a Star of David necklace in and out of costume. Her character is informed by her Judaism, but she's not haunted or by the trauma or torn over her faith or between cultures, and it's never portrayed as something that is or should be at odds with her mutant identity. It's a very healthy approach to representation of her Judaism. The fun fact is that Pryde was inspired by a cute, tough, young Israeli IDF soldier that Claremont had met in Tel Aviv in his time in Israel. In turn, Pryde inspired Joss Whedon's Buffy Summers, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Pryde is, true to her name, a proud Jew and proud mutant, and those two identities and the prejudice they suffer have frequently been equated. In X-Men 199, 1985, Pryde and Magneto attend the annual gathering of Holocaust survivors at the U.S. National Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., where they learn that Kitty's great aunt Chava was in Auschwitz with Magneto, and they knew each other. Again, this is powerful stuff and not what you'd expect from a superhero comic, right? Here's another example from 2018, written by Brian Michael Bendis, a former Orthodox yeshiva student. Kitty talks about passing as both a Jew and a mutant, how the bigotry and hate she encounters because of both identities is relentless, and how she refuses to hide either. By the way, these are very visually rich slides, so feel free to pause and read if you want to. Over the years, Kitty has also provided some of the most meaningful and positive Jewish representation in comics and animation, which is what you see on the bottom right here. And she's not some ancillary character. She's one of the most popular X-Men. In 2017, they even made her leader of the team. Which leads me to the subject of erasure. In the X-Men movies and TV shows, all these Jewish characters are played by non-Jewish actors, and Magneto is the only character who's still Jewish. Now, I'm not saying that's the most important thing in the world, and obviously you don't have to be Jewish to play someone Jewish and vice versa. But in an era of heightened awareness and sensitivity to these things, this stands out, you know? We'll talk more about Jewish representation in episode 8. Arguably, the most famous storyline in X-Men history, and one of the most well-known in comics in general, is the Dark Phoenix saga. It was told over 10 issues in 1980, with plot threads stretching back to 1976. The Cliff Notes version is that one of the X-Men, Jean Grey, is possessed by a cosmic entity known as the Phoenix Force, and cosmic bedlam ensues. It's revealed that the Phoenix Force is a manifestation of the Tiferet, or Tifereth in Yiddish, of the Kabbalistic tree of life. The X-Men are also compared to it, with Xavier as Keter, the crown of the head, and Colossus as Malchut at the base. Tiferet means in Hebrew beauty or glory, which in a religious and metaphysical context is associated with spirituality, heart, joy, and compassion, and connected to the light of creation, which is probably the connection that Claremont is making here. This mystical, esoteric Jewish concept was not only the basis for a popular comic book story, it was adapted in 3 cartoons and 2 films. Two other famous, widely adapted storylines are Days of Future Past in the 80s and Age of Apocalypse in the 90s. Both rely heavily on Holocaust imagery and references and involve genocide and concentration camps. Days of Future Past, which we see here, takes place in a possible near future in which mutants have largely been exterminated. Those who've survived are forced into hard labor, are marked with a tattoo of the letter M, and are designated with numbers. This was adapted in 1992 into the animated show, and more loosely in the 2014 movie of the same name, also called Days of Future Past. Even this movie poster you see in the top right evokes this kind of fascist and Nazi propaganda imagery. Age of Apocalypse in the 90s similarly takes place in a world devastated by totalitarianism and racial warfare, and is rife with evocative imagery like the mass graves you see here. It even introduced a villain named Holocaust. It got some pushback on that. They later renamed him to the less specific Genocide. Despite or because of these themes, by the 90s, the X-Men, which were a modest failure at first, became the biggest property in comics. In October 1991, X-Men Volume 2, Number 1, which you see here, sold 8.2 million copies, which still holds the record for the best-selling comic of all time. It spawned a multitude of spin-offs and specials. It became a hit animated show, at the time the most expensive cartoon ever made. Fun fact, produced by Israeli-American media mogul Chaim Saban, the man behind Power Rangers. It was a successful series of video games, a massive toy line, and every form of merchandising you can imagine. The X-Men went from an obscure name outside comics to a household name. And with that, they brought their themes and lessons to millions around the world. Which is as important today. Superhero comics and movies may be entertainment, but that doesn't mean they're not important. The X-Men are, in a very real way, powerful tools of raising awareness of the Holocaust and building sympathy for others. In 2008, the mini-series Magneto Testament, very evocative name, written by the Jewish Greg Pak, finally made Magneto explicitly Jewish, revealing that his real name, his birth name, was Max Eisenhardt. It also revealed that as a kid in Auschwitz, he survived as a Sonderkommando, which added to his survivor's guilt and rage. It's only nominally a supervillain origin story. This is a Holocaust story, and it's not an easy read. And this can be found not in Yad Vashem or the U.S. Holocaust Museum, but any neighborhood comic book shop or Barnes & Noble. On a lighter note, the X-Men's success has also had some unforeseen consequences. Most toys are made in China, and human action figures, like Barbie, let's say, are subject to a higher import tariff when they're brought to the United States to be sold than non-human figures, like, say, dinosaurs. So in 2002-2003, Marvel subsidiary Toy Biz argued in court that mutants aren't human and won. A commercial victory, but at what cost? There's also the Israel metaphor. In various stories, mutants have attempted to establish a mutant homeland. One such attempt was on the imaginary tiny island of Genosha, it's in the Indian Ocean, which was referred to as Mutant Israel, explicitly referred to as such. In 2001, it was destroyed and all of its inhabitants killed. It's a disturbing metaphor, and its destruction and the discussion these characters are having here, whether it's a good idea for all these mutants to be in one place, can be read in a number of ways. It can be a warning of the very real existential threat to the Jewish state, as an argument for the necessity of Israel, or against kibbutz galuyot, the gathering of the diaspora, which, if you don't know, is a tenet of Zionism named after the promise of Moses in Deuteronomy, which calls for all Jews to immigrate to Israel. More recently, in 2019, mutants attempted it again, this time on the island nation of Krakoa, also imaginary in the Atlantic, vowing no more, never again. They adopted a more hardline approach, establishing their sovereign state as fact, regardless of international recognition or approval. Every mutant in the world is automatically eligible for citizenship, which is, of course, Israel's law of return, by which every Jewish person can become a citizen. The reference to Israel is again explicit, as we see here on the left, in a scene taking place in Jerusalem. They also created, the mutants on Krakoa also created the native language, Krakoan, because, according to Magneto, one cannot create a distinct culture without it. That's almost a verbatim quote of Eliezer ben Yehuda, that's the chap on the bottom right, the Russian Jewish linguist known as the revivalist of the Hebrew language. He sort of revived modern Hebrew. The Israeli metaphor seems to be ambivalent in this case. This storyline was written by Jonathan Hickman, to the best of my knowledge, not Jewish. On one hand, the metaphor can be read as a veneration of Jewish self-determination, but also as a criticism of Israel. Krakoa is created without war on uninhabited land, with no one directly affected but mutants. But this is also when the metaphor comes apart, because Krakoa is a new country and new culture created ex nihilo, not a revival of an ancient one. And it's on arbitrary land, not one with deep ties to mutants. And there was no ongoing mutant presence on that land either. There's also a moment where suicide bombs are referred to as the last refuge of a conquered people, which actually got some pushback. There's some op-eds against that, which is a simplistic and factually wrong argument, and might even be read as justification. This storyline is still ongoing, so we'll see where it goes. As for the X-Men movies, they too have strong Jewish presence. Everybody we see here is Jewish. They were all produced by Lauren Schuler Donner. A couple were also produced or executive produced by Avi Arad. I discuss him in episode 3 on Spider-Man, available on the CSP website exclusively for members. 4 of these movies were directed by Bryan Singer, who also produced and co-wrote a 5th. and one was directed by Brett Ratner. Again, no Jews. Fun fact, Singer, who also directed Apt Pupil, which is about the Holocaust, also directed Superman Returns in 2006, which is a loose sequel to the Christopher Reeve Superman films, the first of which was directed by Richard Donner, husband of Lauren Schuler Donner. I talk about Donner and Superman in episode 1. It all fits together. In the first movie, after the disturbing opening in Auschwitz that we saw earlier, the next scene is a congressional debate over a proposed Mutant Registration Act. The connection is clear. The Nuremberg laws, the 1935 Nazi legislation identifying and segregating Jews. The kid from the camp is now an old man listening in on the hearings, who we now learn is Magneto. He then says to Xavier, "I've heard these arguments before." So it's very, very clear. The film, for all its fantasy and action and special effects, and it's about people who shoot lasers from their eyes, it's a Holocaust story, with Jews, and other minorities for that matter, recast as mutants. And Magneto as both is the bridge. The climax of the movie, clearly not meant to be a subtle metaphor, takes place on Ellis Island in the Statue of Liberty. In this context, they become ironic symbols of American greatness, meant to emphasize the dichotomy, almost schizophrenia, between the ideals of equality, justice, and welcoming, and the harsh reality, including state-sanctioned discrimination and persecution of minorities in American history. Several reviews criticized the X-Men film for trivializing the Holocaust, calling it exploitive, offensive, yada yada. I find this criticism itself offensive. First of all, the movie it trivializes the Holocaust. It's not taken as anything light. Second, I think it's a myopic and dangerous perspective. The Holocaust should not be, something that happened back then over there to those people. That it's dangerous to always contextualize it in that way. It should not be disconnected from the here and now. In my view, it's imperative to constantly find new contexts and new entryways for each generation to understand and apply in the here and now. The movie actually, again, in my opinion, did a very good job tying the Holocaust with America's own past and present-day bigotries. It taught audiences, mostly young people, that Nazism isn't a historical event, it's a moral danger. If we're not careful, we can become that. It's not a substitute for factual historical knowledge, but it's no less important. Auschwitz shows up again in 2 more of these movies. Again, this is a superhero franchise, and there's 3 movies showing Auschwitz, as well as other Jewish elements from the comics. Here we see a young Magneto hunting Nazis in Argentina after the war, like he did in the comic. And an entire movie was based on Days of Future Past. Since 2000, when the first X-Men movie came out, there have been 13 X-Men films. There's even one more coming up. It's the franchise that launched the current superhero dominance of cinema. And it continues to promote its message of coexistence and tolerance. Thank you.